The NHL entry draft is always somewhat unpredictable, and this year was certainly no exception to that, and especially from a Kraken perspective, where going into it, there's only two things that we thought we knew. One, they were probably going to end up picking up a right-shotted defenseman with the 4th overall pick, and more likely than not, that was going to be Simon Nemeth. And the other thing was that they were probably going to build from the back end forward, picking up a number of defensemen and some forwards here and there, and maybe a goaltender or two. Of course, that's not exactly how things panned out. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome into the recap of the 2022 NHL entry draft for the Seattle Kraken, the second ever entry draft for the Kraken and the first one where they actually earned their spot in the draft. Unfortunately, this year that was largely due to losing more games than winning, as they picked 4th overall. Of course, if you are watching this video, you probably already knew that, and you also probably already well know who the Kraken took with that 4th overall pick. And as I alluded to in the intro, it's certainly not the player that the vast majority of us, except for maybe one or two of you in my live stream of the entry draft, expected going in, as the, for years, consensus 1st overall pick in this draft ended up slipping to the 4th pick, where the Kraken wasted no time in selecting Shane Wright. Now, for those of you who did join for the live stream, or at least have seen my reaction to the events that led up to Shane Wright getting picked and the pick itself, well, I think I'm certainly in the majority of Kraken fans in saying that we were all very, very excited to see that Shane Wright not only fell to the Kraken, but that they actually selected him. Though it's safe to say there was a lot of nervous feelings leading up to the actual pick, even after the Arizona Coyotes took Logan Cooley before, with some feelings of wondering whether or not the Kraken were going to just stick to their guns and take the right-shotted defenseman that was left, or especially for those of us that are Seahawks fans, and after Gary Bettman came up between the 3rd and 4th picks and announced that there were 2 trades, we're certainly pretty concerned about the fact that one of those trades might be the Kraken trading down and allowing someone else to take Shane Wright in order to get some sort of package in return. Fortunately, the Kraken didn't do either of those things, just took that 4th overall pick, said thank you very much, and took Shane Wright with it. Now, as I've already mentioned, as of a month or maybe even 2 weeks before last week's entry draft, Shane Wright had been the consensus 1st overall pick for this draft for years. This was largely seen as the Shane Wright entry draft, so I think it's fairly easy to see why Kraken fans were so excited for him to be available at the 4th overall pick and then to see the Kraken actually draft him. But maybe there are still some of you who don't know who Shane Wright is or what all the excitement is actually about. Put simply, Shane Wright was the best player available in the draft, at least in my opinion anyway. Obviously, 3 other NHL teams thought differently, and granted they are all 18-year-olds, so it will be some number of years before we actually know which one of these guys turns out to be the best at the NHL level. But at least as far as Shane Wright is concerned, he earned all the acclaim that made him the consensus 1st overall pick up until just a couple weeks before the draft. What got Wright onto the radar as the likely 1st overall pick in this year's entry draft, the first year of his eligibility, is the fact that he became, a few years ago, one of what is still just 7 players that have ever been granted exceptional status into the CHL, which basically means that a player is so good from a young age that they are allowed to join the CHL early. For the sake of time, I'll skip over the details of how exceptional status works and all of that, and just get right to the names of the other players that have achieved it to prove the point. Names that include guys like John Tavares, the first one to achieve it, Aaron Ekblad, and Connor McDavid, a name you probably well know at this point, and if you don't, then welcome to hockey. Now, I suppose it is also fair to mention that it's not necessarily a guarantee, being an exceptional status player, that they will be a great player in the NHL. A couple of the other ones in Joe Veleno and Sean Day have, well, not quite gotten to that point in their NHL careers, and in the case of Sean Day, has hardly gotten his NHL career going. But still, it is a pretty good company to hold, and as far as who the 6th one is that isn't Shane Wright, that would be Connor Bedard, the current consensus 1st overall in next year's entry draft. So I guess we'll see what happens in the weeks leading up to that draft. But of course, being named an exceptional status player happened a few years ago, so let's see numbers-wise how those few years in the OHL that he had went before this year's draft. Now, looking at his numbers, it's not hard to see how he ended up getting that exceptional status with his U16 team, especially in that last season, putting up 150 points in 72 games. But then getting to his years in the OHL, well, for one thing, he was immediately named an assistant captain with the Kingston Frontenacs, where in that first year he put up 66 points in 58 games on 39 goals and 27 assists, and then had a pretty good showing with the U17 Canada team. Then his second year in the OHL, that didn't happen because of COVID, which definitely threw a bit of a wrench in his whole development and could have played a role in how he ended up slipping out of that number one pick in the first place. Still, at the U18 tournament, he did end up putting up 14 points in 5 games. And then this year in the OHL, he ends with 94 points in 63 games on 32 goals and 62 assists. Nearly an assist per game, and then you tack on 32 goals to that. And then in the playoffs, granted the Frontenacs weren't the best team, so it didn't go as long for him as it potentially could have, but he still put up 14 points in 11 games, again with an assist per game and 3 goals on top of it. Of course, then this does leave the question of how Wright ended up falling to the Kraken at 4 anyway. Is there something that those 3 other teams saw in him that the Kraken didn't? Do they know something Seattle doesn't? Is he just going to end up being a bust? Well, again, he's just 18 years old and he hasn't played a single game in the NHL, obviously, so time will only tell, but I think it's pretty safe to say that it's unlikely he'll end up being a bust. Again, that missed year of hockey, thanks to COVID, definitely played a role and put a lot more pressure on his performance in this year's OHL season, which didn't get off to the best start for him, still nothing to scoff at necessarily, but wasn't the first overall pick type of stats that scouts might have been looking for. Now, he still did end the season on an absolute tear and put up some pretty big numbers as we just went over, including the limited playoff run that the Frontenacs had. Still, it ended up being enough, especially with the larger breadth of international play that the eventual first overall pick in Slafkovsky ended up having, that pushed him over the top to convince the Canadiens to go with him, on top of the fact that he is certainly bigger than Shane Wright. And then at the second overall pick, the Devils were never really thinking Wright in the first place. They already have the center position pretty well taken care of from a young player standpoint. So defense is definitely where they were looking if they didn't get Slafkovsky, who is a winger. Now, that of course leaves the Arizona Coyotes, who do take a center over Shane Wright, that being Logan Cooley. For that, Cooley's a great player, and assuming the Coyotes had taken Wright, I would have been happy for the Kraken to get him. In the end, that probably just comes down to the fact that the Coyotes were just honed in on Cooley expecting to get him, and when he was available, they didn't really think about who else was available and just took Cooley, which fortunately left Wright for the Kraken. Still, as far as the two of them are concerned, that being Cooley and Wright, Cooley is certainly the more flashy style of player than Wright is. For Wright, the scouting report is pretty much that there are no flaws in his game. He is an NHL player when it comes to puck handling and how he carries himself on the ice, plus he's a well-known leader in any of the teams he's been to, but he doesn't have that flashy aspect of the game, especially offensively, that Cooley does, and that scouts especially like to see in a potential first overall pick. Of course, when it came to Cooley or Wright, that was a third overall pick, but I guess it still stands. Plus, as an added bonus, specifically from a Kraken standpoint, Wright definitely fits a lot better what the Kraken have been trying to do when building their team than Cooley does. Now again, Cooley might be a bit more flashy and maybe even more offensively talented than Wright, but Wright is certainly the better all-around player, and again, doesn't really have any obvious flaws, at least in his junior level play. Which, again, for a team like the Kraken that have been building a forward group that is also very defensively minded or good at all ends of the ice, that's something that fits their style much better, especially to go along with their previous second overall pick in last year's draft in Matty Beniers. And at least for me anyway, while they may not be Draisaitl and McDavid, when it comes to that duo, again, as I've said a few times, while we don't know what the future holds, I'm certainly excited to see the future of the Kraken with Wright and Beniers down the middle. So, now that we've talked about Shane Wright, that just leaves the rest of them, and there were quite a few, as the Kraken selected almost all the picks that they had going into the draft, with the one exception of trading up with a 4th and a 5th round to move up in the 3rd round. Still, it's 11 more picks that the Kraken end up making, and while, like I said in the beginning, we kind of thought the Kraken might be going more defense first, They end up selecting 7 more forwards, and 5 of those are centers, ending with Shane Wright included with 6 centers in 12 picks. So definitely building that depth down the middle. Even if not all of those guys obviously make it to the NHL level, and even if they do, they might not all end up being centers. Still though, a lot of center depth. We start though on the wing with the first pick the Kraken made in the second round, that being the 35th overall pick, where they took right winger Jagger Firkus from the Moose Jaw Warriors of the WHL. And while Shane Wright might be more the all-around solid player, even if he isn't all that flashy, Firkus is much more the flashy style player, known for being able to easily handle opposing defensemen one-on-one, and has a very, very good shot that he can pick his spot and put it in past even expected NHL goaltenders. Offensive skill and playmaking ability, not just shooting the puck, but also passing it, that earned him the nickname, or at least his playstyle, the nickname anyway, of the Firkus Circus in Moose Jaw. And also ended up getting him on the board with points more often than not, as he ended up putting up 80 points in 66 games in this last WHL season, which was a huge breakout season for him. That coming on 36 goals and 44 assists. One of those goals in the playoffs, so actually not one of those goals, it was one of his 12 points in 10 games of those playoffs on 6 goals and 6 assists, so one of those 6 goals being a lacrosse goal from behind the net. Something that anybody that saw Trevor Zegras from the Ducks this last year well knows what that looks like and how exciting that could be to see happen in a Kraken jersey. Also of great interest to the Kraken, Firkus' puck handling ability and agility with the puck make him especially dangerous on a power play, which, considering how the power play went for the Kraken last year, is something they could definitely use the help with, even if it might not be for a couple of years when it comes to Firkus specifically. Still, this is a player that early in the second round could end up being a bit of a steal and has a high ceiling. Granted that he fell that far because unlike a guy like Shane Wright or some of the other players, he didn't quite have the breadth of experience at the WHL that a guy like Wright, for example, had at the OHL, where he only had a few games in the previous couple of seasons, and while he had 14 points in 23 games the year previous, this last year was certainly his breakout season. Still though, this is definitely another player that's exciting to think what the future could end up being for him in a Kraken jersey, especially if he were to, say, end up on a line with either a Beniers or Wright that can get him the puck in some space where he can use that creativity and scoring talent that he has. One thing that Firkus does lack that we have seen the Kraken go for time and time again when it comes to picking players either in an entry draft or even the expansion draft is size at just 5'10", 150 pounds. Especially that pounds part, he's going to have to put on a few more of those to not get constantly pushed off the puck at the NHL level. That, however, is not a problem for the next guy the Kraken took in the second round, that being the big Finnish winger in Jani Nyman. Or Nyman, I'm honestly not sure exactly which one it is. Either way, at 6'4", 220 pounds, this guy has the size. He's also another guy who's shown that he's particularly good at handling the puck in the offensive zone, and can definitely put some points on the board, where he ended up being at times, the highest points producer in Finland's secondary pro league, kind of like the AHL over here, where he ended up putting up 35 points in 34 games with 18 goals and 17 assists, and got to wear the gold helmet for the leading points producer for at least part of the season. Plus, he even did get to play a few games in Finland's elite top pro league, though it was only 10 games and he only had 1 point on an assist in those 10 games, but still in international play at the International Juniors Tournament with Finland's U18 team, he put up 21 points in 21 games there on 11 goals and 10 assists, and even got to play in 3 games where he had an assist in the U20 tournament, playing above his age. Though, well, like Firkus, he is noted to have a particularly strong shot that should translate well to the NHL level and potentially be an above average NHL shot. His big downside is his skating ability, which is just kind of not that great, and to the NHL standards would be well below average in the NHL. That having been said, again, he is a 6'4" teenager, so there's a chance that he just kind of needs a little bit of time to get used to his body, especially on skates, and that's the kind of thing that you could improve over time. Still, we'll end up having to see where things go for him, He's likely to still be playing in Finland this next year, hopefully a little bit more time in that elite league, and we'll see where things go for him in the future. With their third pick in the second round, the Kraken did go the goaltender route, the only goaltender they end up selecting in this year's draft, taking another Finnish guy in Niklas Kokko. Now, this one did seem like it might be a bit of a reach at the time, but who knows? It's a goaltender, and anything can happen with goaltenders from year to year, so it seems like the Kraken scouting staff saw something that they liked in the Finnish goaltender. Had a pretty decent year last year, spending most of it in a U20 league in Finland, where he had a 2.06 goals against average and a 914 save percentage. He did also get to play one game in the Finnish Elite League, and he didn't let in a goal. And it is just one game, but he has yet to be scored on in Finland's Elite League, so I guess there's that. Again, just kind of have to wait and see with goaltenders. It'll be quite a while before he plays for the Kraken, at least probably anyway. Finally, at least for the second round anyway, with their fourth and final pick of the second round, the Kraken take the first of the rest of those centers in David Goyette of the Sudbury Wolves in the OHL. Now, Goyette is another player that is particularly skilled with the puck, also a bit on the smaller end, kind of like Firkus, also 6'10 or 6'11 depending on where you see his stats, and somewhere around 175 pounds. Still, particularly skilled with the puck again. The one downside here with Goyette is that he hasn't been particularly consistent from the scouting perspective at least, and would have to show a little bit more consistency to get to the NHL and make a difference on an NHL roster. Again, hopefully the Kraken roster. Still, at least when it comes to points production, this last year in the OHL for him was a pretty good one, where he ended up putting up 73 points in 66 games on 33 goals and 40 assists, all for a not particularly strong Wolves team. So again, as long as that compete level and consistency of compete level can stay up for him, this is a player that could have a pretty big ceiling, even if the floor might be below the NHL. Moving on to the third round, well, as we know, the Kraken may not have gotten their right shot defenseman with the fourth overall pick. They do take the first defenseman of the draft, at least for them anyway, here early on in the third round, that being Ty Nelson. He looks to be a pretty good all-around right shot defenseman with a particularly strong skating ability, and even put up a fair number of points from the blue line for the North Bay Battalion in the OHL, with 51 points in 66 games this last season, that coming on 9 goals and 42 assists. The big downside for him is, again, size, where he's just 5'10 and almost 200 pounds, but again, not particularly big for a defenseman, and while he still was able to lay a fair number of hits, considering his size, it's something that could hold him back from the NHL level if he isn't able to stand out in some other areas. With the 91st overall pick also in the third round, the one pick that the Kraken moved up to, trading a fourth and a fifth to get there, also the first ever draft day trade for the Kraken in franchise history, they end up selecting Ben McDonald, who is also probably, at least for the Kraken, the biggest unknown of this draft. And that's because, unlike a lot of the other guys taking this draft who played in, say, the OHL or WHL or maybe over in Europe or something like that, he has only really played in high school prep league. And granted, he played pretty well there with 29 points in 22 games on 14 goals and 15 assists. It's kind of hard to tell how that experience would compare to some of the other players taken in this draft. Still, for the Kraken to move up there to take him, there has to be something that the scouting staff saw in him that they liked enough to do so. And while we will probably have to wait and see him even play at a college level, he will be playing in a couple of years at Harvard and is still a few years away from the NHL level either way. In the fourth round, with the 100th overall pick, the Kraken end up selecting Tyson Jodnoth, another defenseman, this time on the left side, and also probably has the coolest last name of any of the guys in this Kraken draft class. He's another particularly offensively skilled defenseman, though again on the smaller end. He's probably the best defenseman that the BCHL had to offer this last couple of seasons, where he did put up a fair number of points 2 years ago, putting up 17 points in 20 games on 4 goals and 13 assists. And then this last year, putting up another 50 points in 52 games, nearly a point per game on 9 goals and 41 assists. And then a little bit of a downtick in the playoffs, just 5 points in 14 games there. He is committed to play next year at the University of Wisconsin, so we'll see how that goes for him. Again, an undersized defenseman that has good offensive talent, but could use a little bit development on the defensive side of things. and hopefully he can do that in college. As we get deeper in the draft with the 123rd overall pick, the Kraken get another one of those centers in Tucker Robertson, who does have pretty good hockey IQ, well above most of the guys in the OHL that he was playing against, and is also pretty skilled with the puck, which definitely showed up with the 81 points in 68 games that he was able to put up on 40 goals and 41 assists. So definitely a pretty productive points producer, obviously in the offensive end at the OHL level, and not terrible on the defensive end either. For him, the big issue is, well, again, he's on the smaller end at 5'11", but also is not the strongest skater, which does make him maybe a little bit harder to translate to the NHL level, and especially translate scoring to the NHL level. Still, with that amount of scoring ability at the OHL level, if he can improve that skating ability with maybe the help of some Kraken development staff, then this could be a guy that could surprise down the road. Getting towards the end of the draft in the 6th round with the 164th overall pick, the Kraken took another center in Barrett Hall. Again, another guy who's only played at the high school level, though taken much lower down in the draft, so it's, definitely a place where the Kraken are willing to take some chances on a guy that looks to have decent offensive talent, and at 6 foot is a decent frame for an 18-year-old. But again, not a particularly strong skater and not a huge amount of experience that is easy to compare to some of the other players. So, like anyone taken this far down in the draft, is a bit of a long shot to make the NHL, but he is committed to play at the NCAA level at St. Cloud State, so we'll see how that goes for him, and who knows down the road. And finally, with the final pick in the draft for the Kraken anyway, with the 196th overall pick in the 7th round, they select Kyle Jackson, a center and teammate of Ty Nelson in North Bay with the Battalion. And this was, for him, definitely a breakout in the OHL. He is, at 19, a bit older than the rest of the guys taken in this draft, or at least the rest of the guys the Kraken took in this draft anyway, but did have a very good season in the OHL with 62 points in 45 games on 30 goals and 32 assists. So, yeah, pretty good season for him. And then the playoffs continue that with 14 points in 12 games on 9 goals and 5 assists there. So, again, probably a long shot taken in the 7th round, but a breakout season, and who knows, maybe it's a sign of things to come for him. Again, he's another one of these guys that on the scouting report has his main downside being just a okay skating ability, being the main thing that would keep him out of the NHL. So if the Kraken can find a way to improve the skating ability of some of these draft picks, they might have gotten a few steals here, but all in all, it was kind of a surprising draft from the Kraken in the aspect that they went very heavy on centers and not so much on defensemen, with actually just 3. One of the 4 that I talked about earlier was actually not a pick by the Kraken. It was a mistake on the end of the Athletic. But aside from that, again, a lot of centers that the Kraken ended up taking here. And obviously the big surprise being Shane Wright. Not necessarily that the Kraken selected him, and more that they had the opportunity to select him. A lot of guys as well taking this draft class, so the Kraken using the vast majority of the picks they had this season, trading 2 of them to move up again in that 3rd round to get 1. But still, a pretty good draft class, and when it comes to hockey, or really any pro sport when it comes to drafting, you throw enough darts at the board and 1 or 2 of them are bound to hit. Actually, while we're on the subject of the overall thoughts of the draft, another kind of curious thing about this draft, other than just the large number of forwards and especially centers that the Kraken took, was that a lot of players that they took, even on the defensive end, were a bit on the smaller end, with a lot of guys at 5'10", 5'11". I mean, even Shane Wright isn't all that big at this point, which, considering how they had built the team up to this point with size and physicality definitely being seemed like something that they were going for, it's a bit interesting to see them go for a lot of these smaller guys and maybe a little bit more speed and skill rather than big and physical. Either way, maybe they're just trying to develop these guys and hope some of them at the age of 18 just grow a few inches in the next few years. Again, time will only tell. Most of these players won't be playing for 2, 3, 4 years, and some of them probably never will make the NHL. Or, I mean, some of them certainly won't make the NHL. It's hard to know which ones those are, but anyway. The one guy that we definitely will see, I would say, at some point this season would be Shane Wright. there's a decent chance that Firkus, if he has a good training camp and a good showing in the preseason, could make an appearance at some point in the season. But definitely Shane Wright. And yeah, I'll be excited to see which one of Shane Wright or Matty Beniers ends up winning the Calder, and which one of them lifts the Stanley Cup first when the Kraken inevitably win it in 2023. Okay, maybe I'm kidding about the Kraken being inevitable to win the Stanley Cup in 2023. I mean, being honest, they're not even inevitable to make the playoffs, much less win the Stanley Cup. That having been said, one of Beniers or Wright getting a chance at the Calder is certainly not out of the question, and honestly, both of them could make a run at it. We'll just have to wait and see what this next season and these next few years hold for the Kraken. Either way, it's a young, exciting core that the Kraken are building here, and it's kind of nice to see them building it from the center out rather than the back forward, at least from the standpoint of getting to see some exciting hockey, even if the puck ends up in our net or the Kraken net more often than it ends up in the other net. Definitely we want it the other way around. But anyway, let me know what you thought of this draft for the Kraken down in the comment section below. Which one of the picks was your favorite? Maybe outside of Shane Wright, because obviously we all would probably pick that one. And which one of the maybe middle to late round picks do you see as being a guy that could be a surprise breakout player and a maybe difference maker in the NHL? There's always one or two of them in every draft, so why not one of these guys that the Kraken picked, especially considering the number of guys they picked in this draft. Finally, if you have made it to this point in the video, thank you very much for sticking with me to this point. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel. And until next time, where we'll probably be talking about something free agent related, as that's coming up here in just a little bit. Stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.